Hello, I'm Steve Young, and welcome to Safe Deposit Locks Volume 2. This is the second in a three-part set of videotapes intended to teach you all that you need to know to service, rekey, and make keys for the most common safe deposit locks. The fixed lever locks, which must be disassembled in order to be rekeyed, were covered in Safe Deposit Locks Volume 1. Opening techniques for safe deposit boxes will be covered in Safe Deposit Locks Volume 3. This tape covers the service procedures for the more common resettable safe deposit locks. A resettable lock can be rekeyed without disassembling it, or in many cases without even removing it from the door. These locks are designed to be rekeyed by bank personnel with a minimal amount of training. So it's not surprising that a lot of the work that you will do on these locks involves repairing them after someone has tried to reset them unsuccessfully. As we go along, I will stress the things that commonly go wrong in the resetting procedure, as well as how to solve these problems. The information contained in this tape cannot be properly absorbed in one viewing. As you watch the tape, be prepared to pause or rewind your VCR until you thoroughly understand each section. Pay particular attention to the close-up views of the lock parts. Understanding how all of the parts of a lever lock work together is the most important part of learning to service these locks. In order to get the most out of this series of videotapes, you must understand the terminology that we will be using. That is why we have included a glossary of terms with the quick reference guide that was packed with your tape. Before viewing this tape, you should take a few minutes to study this glossary and keep it handy while you're watching the tape. Since this tape is part of a series and each tape builds upon the subjects covered in the previous tapes, I will often refer back to things that were covered in Volume 1, such as how to cut safe deposit box keys from code. It is very important that you thoroughly understand the material presented in each tape before going on to the next one. Now, before we begin learning about the resettable safe deposit locks, let's take a quick look at some of the tools that are used only with this type of lock. These are changing tools made by a variety of manufacturers. The usage of these tools will be covered in detail as we cover each of the locks that they are designed to fit. Generally, the changing tool is used when the lock is in the unlocked position to release the levers or the fence components. This allows the key to be removed from the lock and a new key to be inserted. The change tool is then used to lock the levers or fence components into the new combination so that the new keys will then operate the lock. This is a setup key for the Mosler Rapid Set lock. This special key is used to place a new lock in the unlocked position so that the guard levers can be set to the bank's existing guard key. After the guard levers have been set, the setup key will no longer operate the lock. That completes the tool section. Now let's take a look at the Sergeant Greenleaf 4340 series of locks. There are two general types of resettable locks. Locks which use resettable levers and locks which use a resettable fence. The Sergeant Greenleaf 4340 uses resettable levers. Although this lock is no longer in production, there are many of them in the field, and quite a few variations of this lock were used on inner compartments in safes. To begin the disassembly of this lock, first remove the screws which hold the horn plate in place. Once the screws have been removed, the horn plate will lift free of the lock body. All of the RENTER'S levers on this lock are identical. Each lever consists of two portions, the portion with the gate and the portion with the sweep and the spring attached. During the changing procedure, the change key is inserted through the back of the lock, which separates the two portions of the lever. This allows the old key to be removed and a new key to be inserted. Then the change tool is turned, locking the two portions of the levers back together again, and the lock should work with the new keys. If something goes wrong during the change procedure, then neither the old key or the new key will operate the lock. In that case, it is necessary to disassemble the lock, reset it back to the setup key, and then change the combination a second time. The guard side of this lock is very similar to the Sergeant Greenleaf locks we saw on the first tape. The levers on the guard side are not resettable, and you will often see spacers like this to set the guard side up to existing guard keys. Once all of the guard levers have been removed from the lock, we're ready to start on the renter's side. Remember to lay all of the guard levers out in such a way that you can put them back into the lock exactly the way they came out. The renter's post is topped by a plug just like on the earlier locks, but this one is cut away on the bottom. The driver itself is a single die-cast part. The foot or cam is a part of the driver. Very carefully lift the driver out from under the levers while holding the levers in the lock to keep them from snapping out. To remove the renter's levers, begin by compressing the spring and lifting the lower portion of the lever free of the post. When it is out of the way, you can lift off the upper portion of the lever, which contains the gate. Between each of the levers, you will find a very thin spacer. This spacer is very fragile. Be very careful that you do not bend it. If you bend it, the lock will not work properly. Continue to remove the levers one at a time. It is not necessary to keep the levers in order because all of the levers are identical. Below the last resettable lever, there is another spacer and then a non-resettable lever. This lever contains a teardrop-shaped hole in the top of it which blocks the change key from entering the lock until the lock is in the correct position to be changed. This protects the relatively fragile levers from damage. Below the block lever, we have the lock bolt itself. Notice that there is an opening in the upper left-hand corner of the lock bolt. This aligns with the change key hole in the lock housing when the bolt is in the locked position. This allows the change key to enter the lock for the changing procedure. The lock bolt will lift free of the lock, and you can see that we have two separate fences which interact with the two lever stacks. With all of the parts out of the lock, we can see the change key hole. This post acts as a guide for the lock bolt, as well as this post. These two posts are stops for the guard key. These prevent the guard key from rotating 360 degrees in the lock. Here we have one complete lever assembly. Anytime you disassemble one of these locks, always be sure to check that the spring is properly staked into the lower portion of the lever. If these springs come loose, it will prevent the lock from operating properly. You can see the teeth located on the matching faces of the levers which interlock with each other. The change key is inserted into this opening in the upper portion of the gate and slides the two portions of the lever apart. This slot allows the rear portion of the lever to flex enough so that when the change key is turned in the lock, the lever will actually slide over the pivot post, releasing the teeth and allowing the combination to be changed. When the change key turns back, the lever snaps back into place around the pivot, locking in the combination. Here we can see how the two portions of the lever mesh together. When we reassemble one of these locks, we must make sure that we put the levers back in such a way that a standard setup key, which is provided with these locks, will operate the lock. To do this, we mesh the top tooth on the bottom lever with the top slot on the top lever like this. This is too low, and this is too high. The two portions must mesh exactly like this in order for the lock to operate properly with the setup key. Here we have a renter's key, the change key, and a standard setup key. The spacing and depth information for the setup key is contained in the pamphlet which was packed along with your videotape. Here is our block lever. All of the block levers are the same. This means that the tip cut on all renter's keys will be identical for this series of locks. And here we have one of the shims which separate the levers. These prevent the moving portions of the levers from getting hung on each other. These are very thin and very easily bent, especially towards the tip here. Be very careful with these. If this portion gets bent, it will hang up on the levers, preventing the lock from working. Here is a guard lever and the shim washer, which is used in match work when setting up a new lock to an existing guard key. These levers and their operation is the same as in the fixed lever locks, which we illustrated in Volume 1 of this series. Here is the guard driver, the renter's driver, and the renter's plug. This contains the warding if the renter's key is a warded key. These are varied from lock to lock. Notice once again that the guard driver does not have a foot. Only the renter's driver has a foot, which is what retracts the lock bolt. Now we're ready to begin reassembling our lock. The first step is to reinstall the lock bolt. Make sure that it moves smoothly on its posts. Next, slide the renter's post back into its socket in the lock housing, and then bring in the block lever. Compress its spring and gently slide it into place against the lock bolt. Next, slide the first shim into place on top of the block lever, making sure that you don't bend it. Next, bring in the upper portion of the first lever and slide it over the pivot until it seats against the shim. Then, bring in the lower portion of the lever, slide it over the pivot, compress the spring, and gently slide it down until it contacts the first portion of the lever. Then, mesh the teeth in the proper position and make sure that both portions of the lever are seated against the shim. When this is complete, bring in another shim and repeat the same procedure for each lever in turn. When all of the renter's levers are in place and the individual portions of the levers are properly meshed together, then it's time to bring in our guard levers. Remember, all of the renter's levers are identical, so it does not matter what order they go in relation to the way they came out of the lock. However, the guard levers must be put back in exactly the same order that they came out of the lock. When all of the guard levers and the shim washers are back in place in the lock, we can bring the guard driver back into place. Then, insert the renter's post on top of the renter's driver, and we're ready to reinstall the horn plate. Be careful that you do not dislodge any of the portions of the levers as you slide the horn plate back into place. When the horn plate is secure on the top of the lock, slide the screws back into place, tighten, and we're ready to set the lock to our key. If we have properly reassembled our lock, the standard setup key will now operate it. Remember, no key will operate the lock until the proper guard key is inserted and turned. Insert the setup key and turn, and it withdraws the lock bolt. Once we have determined that the setup key will operate the lock, we no longer need the guard key to make the change. Insert the setup key into the lock and turn it. Then, from the back side of the lock, insert the change key into the change key opening and turn it. This will release the levers, allowing us to remove the setup key and insert our new renter's key. Notice that the levers are held in place by the lock fence while the change key is turned. Turn the new renter's key a few times to raise the levers properly, then turn the change key back. This will lock the two portions of the levers together. Remove the change key, turn the renter's key to the locked position, insert the guard key, and check the operation of the lock. That completes the Sergeant Greenleaf 4340. Now let's take a look at a very common lock which also uses resettable levers, the Lefebvre 7700. Unlike the Sergeant Greenleaf lock, this lock is non-handed. It will fit onto either a left or right-hand door. Notice that each of the horns has 2 key pulls. This second key pull is used only during the changing process. This allows the old key to be removed and the new key to be inserted. The key cannot turn to this position in normal operation. This is the upper end of the change hub. There is a fixture exactly like this on the back side of the lock, which allows the lock to be reset from either the top or the bottom. This structure also acts as the pivot for both the guard levers and the renter's levers. Just as with all of the other locks we've seen, the first step in the disassembly is to remove the horn plate. As you pull the horn plate free of the lock, be careful that you don't pull the drivers along with it. Each of the drivers fits into a socket in its respective foot. The driver can be lifted free of the lock, leaving the foot behind in the lock. The drivers will usually pull free of the foot very easily. Notice the post on the end of the driver which fits into a socket in the foot. The driver on the guard side of this lock was stuck into the foot. When this happens, all you have to do is turn the driver sideways and work the foot out of the lock. Next, we need to remove the plug from the top of the pivot post. This is also the change hub. Once this is out of the way, we can begin lifting the levers out. All of the renter's levers are identical, and all of the guard levers are identical. So once again, there's no need to place these levers in any particular order. The levers fit onto the pivot post in an alternating order. Just remember that the first lever that goes onto the stack is the renter's lever, then a guard lever, and so on as you reassemble it. Below the first renter's lever, there is a block lever. This block is very similar to the blocks we saw on the Mosler 5700 lock and several other locks. This prevents the renter's key from even going all the way into the lock until the correct guard key has been inserted and turned. Here we see the operation of the renter's foot to withdraw the lock bolt. Notice the stop here on the lock bolt. This point is controlled by the change hub. Here the change hub is in the change position. Now the bolt will go back just slightly further. This is what allows us to remove the key in the change position. The renter's foot will lift out of the lock case very easily. So would the guard foot if it had stayed behind in the lock. Now we can lift the lock bolt straight up and out of the lock, revealing the rest of the change hub. To remove the change hub, all we have to do is lift it straight out of its socket in the lock housing. And that completes the disassembly of the lock. This is a renter's lever. All of the renter's levers are identical. In order to understand the operation of this lock, it's very important that you understand the functions of the different parts of each lever. This is the gate, which accepts the fence, which is a part of the lock bolt. This opening contains the renter's driver. The driver is actually captive inside the lever. When the key is turned, it makes contact with this portion of the lever. This is known as the sweep. This elongated slot contains the change hub, which also acts as the pivot post. The depth of cut that a particular lever will operate with is determined by which one of these notches is locked into the pivot post. This will be illustrated shortly. This is the lever spring. This type of spring is known as an integral spring and is much more reliable than the springs we saw in the earlier lock. This is a guard lever. All of the guard levers are identical. They also contain integral springs just like the renter's levers. The guard levers and the renter's levers overlap and fit over the same pivot post. The pivot post fits through this opening here, and these notches perform the same function that they did on the renter's lever. This is the gate. The fence on the lock bolt is held captive inside this opening inside the guard lever. When the correct keys are inserted into the lock and the lock bolt is withdrawn, the fence passes through the gate and goes out of the lever rather than into the lever. This opening also contains the guard driver, and the guard key makes contact with the levers at this point. This is the change hub, which also acts as the pivot post. We've already seen how this portion of the hub acts as a stop for the lock bolt and then allows the lock bolt to travel further into the lock in the change position. This ridge running along the length of the pivot post is what locks into the small notches in the renter's lever and the guard levers. This is what holds the levers in the proper position once the lock has been set. On the bottom side of the pivot post, there are two openings which accept the change key. This allows us to turn the change hub from the back side of the lock without removing the lock from the door. Here we have the block lever and the change hub aligned as they are inside the lock. The block lever is also known as the K block because it blocks the key. This portion of the lever extends into the keyway of the renter's key so that the key cannot go all the way into the lock until the guard key has been turned in the lock, which lifts the lever, allowing the renter's key to enter the lock completely. Here we have one renter's lever and one guard lever placed on top of the block lever. The pivot post is inserted through all three levers in its correct position. If you remember that the bottom lever in the stack will always be the renter's lever and its springs all go on the same side of the lock, you won't have any trouble reassembling one of these locks. Here we can see in close-up how the change hub locks onto each of the levers. Since the hub locks onto both the guard lever and the renter's levers at the same time, it is impossible to change either the renter's key or the guard key without changing the other key. You must have both keys when you reset one of these locks. The first step in reassembling the lock is to reinstall the change hub. Slide it into its socket in the lock housing. Make sure that it presses against the detent spring. Try the operation of the hub a few times and then turn it as far as it will go counterclockwise and leave it that way. That is the change position. We'll be reassembling the lock with it in the unlocked position, the bolt all the way back and the change hub in the change position. This is the way new locks are shipped from the factory. After the bolt is in place in the lock, bring in the renter's foot and then the guard foot. Notice that there is a distinct difference between the 2 feet. The guard foot has a hook which points towards the top of the lock in this position. When the 2 feet are in place in the lock, bring the K-block lever back into place and snap it over the post in the bolt assembly that compresses the spring. After the K-block is in place, bring in the first renter's lever. Slip it over the change hub, sliding the gate over the fence in the lock bolt. Remember, we're assembling the lock in the unlocked position. Then, bring in a guard lever, slide it into place, and then repeat the same procedure, alternating between renter's levers and guard levers until all of the levers are back in the lock. When the last lever is back in place in the lock, it's time to bring in the drivers. The sockets on the end of the drivers that fit into the feet are different on the 2 drivers. They will only fit properly into the correct foot. First, slide the renter's driver into place, and then the guard driver. Remember, we're assembling the lock in the change position so the keyway points away from the bolt. The plug, which fits on top of the change hub, usually has 2 openings in it to accept the change key. The bottom side of the plug fits exactly onto the top of the change hub. Slip the plug back into place on top of the change hub so that it seats completely against the upper renter's lever. Then we're ready to reinstall the horn plate, tighten the screws, and the lock is completely assembled. This is a Lefebvre 7700 change tool. The two posts on the end of the tool fit into the recesses on the ends of the change hub. These allow us to turn the change hub to change the combination on the lock. Unfortunately, many times one of the posts will break off, leaving us with a useless tool. You can make your own change tool out of a safe deposit key blank like this one. In order to set our lock to the desired key, we first insert and turn the guard key in the guard side until it reaches a positive stop. Then do the same for the desired renter's key. Remember that we assemble the lock in the changed position, so the levers are changing as we turn the keys. Once the keys are against the stop, we then bring in our change tool to turn the change hub back into the locked position. This will lock in our new combination. Once the hub is back into the locked position, we can then turn the keys, extending the lock bolt. It's not necessary to actually remove the keys from the lock, but you do have to turn them back to the key pull position. Now, we can reinsert the keys back into the lock, turn the guard key, and then try the operation of the renter's key. The lock bolt should withdraw smoothly. If we are changing the combination of the lock from one working key to a new key, first we need to insert the guard key into the lock and turn it until it reaches its stop. Then insert the working renter's key into the lock and withdraw the lock bolt. After the lock bolt has been completely withdrawn, bring in our change tool, rotate the change hub. This will release the lock bolt, allowing both keys to turn back to the second key pull position. Then remove the renter's key. Even if you are resetting the lock back to the same guard key, you must turn the guard key to the second key pull position. This allows all of the levers to slip back to the neutral position. Then, turn the guard key until it reaches a positive stop. Insert the correct renter's key and turn it until it reaches its positive stop. Then, bring in the change tool, rotate the change hub to lock in the new combination, try the operation of the lock, and the job is complete. In most cases, it's not necessary to remove the lock from the door in order to change its combination. The change tool can be used just as easily from the back side of the lock. However, some locks are not designed to be changed from the back of the lock. There are many variations of the Lefebvre 7700 lock in use today. This is an old version which uses nylon plugs on the ends of the change hub. These plugs wear out very quickly, and the use of nylon plugs was discontinued shortly after the lock was introduced. Here's the same lock from the back. As you can see, this one is not set up to be changed from the back side. This is an option even on today's locks. Another variation you will occasionally see is a lock which has a smaller number of renter's levers, in which case a spacer like this one is inserted above the top guard lever to take up the space between the lever stack and the top of the lock. Occasionally, you will even encounter this lock as a single nose lock. Inside, the lock is identical to the locks we've just seen, except that between the renter's levers, there are spacers to occupy the space that would be taken up by the guard levers. That completes the Lefebvre 7700 series. Now let's take a look at a series of locks which use resettable fences instead of resettable levers. The Precision P54 and Sergeant Greenleaf 4500 series. Like the Lefebvre lock, this lock is non-handed. However, the guard side and the renter side can be changed independently from each other. It is not necessary to reset both sides at the same time. As with most safe deposit locks, the first step in the disassembly is the removal of the horn plate. With the horn plate removed, this lock is obviously less complicated than the two locks we've seen earlier. Both of the drivers are equipped with a foot, which is a die-cast part of the driver itself. The foot on the guard side points in the opposite direction from the foot on the renter's side. Only the foot on the renter's driver contacts the lock bolt. The foot on the guard driver is used only for timing purposes. After the drivers have been removed from the lock, we can then remove the lever stacks. There is no need to keep the levers in any particular order. All of the levers are identical, and the guard levers are completely interchangeable with the renter's levers. With the last lever removed from the lock housing, we can easily see the resettable fence assemblies attached to the lock bolt and the operation of the bolt itself. The bolt will lift straight up and out of the lock housing along with the resettable fence assemblies. Here we can see the resettable fence assemblies attached to the lock bolt. Each of the fence assemblies consists of 7 identical fence components plus a nut to hold it in place and a screw which is tightened through the lock bolt. From the back side of the lock bolt, we can see the heads of the Allen screws which hold the fence components in place. All of the components of both the guard and renter fence assemblies are completely interchangeable. Here we're removing the screw which holds the guard fence assembly in place. The nut that the screw fits into has 2 holes which fit over posts which are die-cast parts of the lock bolt itself. With the nut out of the way, we can now remove the fence components. There is no need to keep all of the fence components in order because they are all identical. Here is a single fence component. Notice that the end of the fence itself is serrated to prevent picking. We've disassembled the fence assembly for illustration purposes only. In actual service, you would almost never have to disassemble the fence assembly. Here is an individual lever. These levers are virtually identical to the levers that are found in the 4400 series locks. Notice that the forward face of the lever is serrated to prevent picking, and that the lever is equipped with an integral spring. Here we have the screw and the nut which clamp the fence components in place. Anytime you have a steel screw and a brass nut, you need to be very careful about over-torquing the screw to avoid stripping out the nut. Here is the correct change tool for resetting these locks. Never use a regular Allen wrench. It is entirely too easy to strip out the brass nuts which hold the fence components in place. This tool has a specially designed clutch in the handle to prevent over-tightening the screws. If you do not have the correct key for a lock or it has been improperly set, you can reset the lock by resetting all of the fence components to the 0 position. Loosen the screw that clamps the fence components together, let them all fall to the bottom position, and then retighten. Repeat the same procedure for the guard side of the lock, and then reassemble the lock in the unlocked position, just as we did with the Lefebvre lock. Begin the reassembly by inserting the lock bolt back into the lock housing. Make sure that the bolt moves freely, and then slide it all the way back to the unlocked position. Then, bring in the levers, one at a time, and slide them over the pivot with the gate in the lever engaged with the fence assembly. Once all of the levers are back in the lock, it's time to replace the drivers. Slip the foot of the renter's driver underneath the lever pack and make sure that it seats into its socket in the lock housing. Remember that we're reassembling the lock in the unlocked position, so the keyway will be facing at about the 1 o'clock position. Next, replace the guard driver and make sure that it will turn freely. The foot at the base of the guard driver acts as a stop to prevent the driver from turning 360 degrees. Now we're ready to replace the horn plate. Slide the horn plate back into place, tighten the screws, and the lock is reassembled. The first step in putting a lock that we have reassembled in the unlocked position back into service is to set the guard side. Using the change tool, loosen the clamp screw approximately 3.5 turns. Then, insert the guard key into the lock, turn it, and maintain pressure against the stop as you tighten the clamp screw. Tighten the screw until the change tool clicks twice. Remove the change tool and turn the guard key back to the stop position and remove it. Next, we need to set the renter side of the lock. Insert the change tool into the clamp screw on the renter side of the lock, loosen it, and the bolt will be able to travel further back into the lock case. Using the tip of the renter's key, turn the keyway back until you can insert the key, and then turn it to extend the bolt as far as it will go. Using the change tool again, tighten the clamp screw on the renter side of the lock until the tool clicks twice. Once the clamp screw is tight, we can then remove the tool, turn our renter's key to throw the bolt, and the change is complete. Then insert the guard key into the guard side of the lock and check the operation of the renter's key. To reset the renter's side of the lock when you have a working renter's key, the first step is to insert and turn the guard key in the guard side of the lock. Then insert and turn the working renter's key to withdraw the bolt. Using the change tool, loosen the clamp screw on the renter side of the lock only. This will allow the lock bolt to travel further back, and you will be able to remove the renter's key through the second key pull. Now insert your new renter's key into the lock and turn the bolt as far as it will go. The bolt will not travel all the way out. Reinsert the change tool back into the clamp screw, tighten until the change tool clicks twice, remove the tool, and then you can turn the renter's key to throw the bolt. Check the operation, and the job is complete. The reason that the lock bolt cannot be fully extended once the clamp screw has been loosened is that the head of the clamp screw will strike this obstruction inside the lock. In addition, when you loosen the clamp screw, the change tool is inserted through this opening, but when you tighten the clamp screw, it must be inserted through this opening. Therefore, you must remove the change tool after you loosen the clamp screw. When you loosen the clamp screw on the guard side of the lock, this obstruction will prevent the lock bolt from being thrown all the way until you have properly retightened the clamp screw on the guard side as well as on the renter side. The same lock is available with only the renter's side resettable. The guard side uses a fixed fence and levers which are very similar to the levers that were used on the 4400 series, which was covered in Volume 1 of this series. The resetting procedure for the renter side is the same as on the double changeable lock. A third variation of the same lock uses fixed fences on both the guard and the renter side of the lock. This is an inexpensive lock which is generally found as original equipment on new sets of safe deposit boxes. This gives the bank the opportunity to upgrade to a resettable lock in the future if they wish. All of the levers that are used with the fixed fences are numbered, so making a key to these locks or rekeying them would be the same procedure that we illustrated in the first video. On the locks which have fixed fences on both sides, the levers are interchangeable between the guard and the renter side of the lock. Now let's take a look at the Diebold 175/70 series, which has much in common with the locks we've just seen. This series of locks is handed, so it is available in both left and right-hand versions. The first step in the disassembly is to remove the horn plate. One of the first things you'll notice when the horn plate is removed is that the fence assemblies are very similar to those found in the Sergeant Greenlee 4500 series and the Precision P54 series. The drivers are virtually identical to those found in the Diebold 175/05 and 06 locks, which were covered in Volume 1 of this series. But the levers are very interesting. They're not technically levers because they do not move in an arc. We will continue to call them levers for uniformity's sake, however. Each lever slides vertically up and down when the key is inserted and turned. All of the levers are identical on both sides of the lock. They are interchangeable between the guard and the renter's side, and each lever is equipped with an integral spring. Once all of the levers have been removed from the lock, we can see the operation of the lock bolt. The bolt will lift straight up and out of the lock once it has been pushed to the unlocked position. Once again, notice the similarity in the fence assemblies to the Precision P54 and Sergeant Greenleaf 4500 series locks that we just saw. Here we have the lock bolt removed from the lock. Each of the fence assemblies consists of 7 identical fence components and is held in place by a clamp screw and nut assembly just like on the earlier locks. The clamp screws have tamper-resistant heads to prevent the use of an Allen wrench for setting. They are also a little bit heftier than the clamp screws we saw on the earlier locks. If you have one of these locks that is improperly set or you do not have the correct key for it, the resetting procedure is very similar to the other locks, but you must lift all of the fence components just slightly before you retighten the clamp screw. Otherwise, the levers will not go back into the lock. The setting procedure for this lock is also very similar to the other locks, and the movement of the bolt is also limited in the same fashion. When the clamp screw is loosened, it will slide underneath this shelf in the lock housing, allowing the lock bolt to travel back just slightly further so that the key can be withdrawn in the change position. Here we have one of the levers out of the lock. All of the levers are made of brass, but they're coated with a dark lubricating film. The sweep area of the lever is somewhat thinner than the body of the lever. The gate is a little wider than the gates we've seen on the earlier locks, but this is to accommodate the wider fence components. All of the fence components are identical, but once again, it would be very rare for you to have to disassemble a fence assembly. Here is the clamp screw and nut assembly along with the end of the change tool. Notice the tamper-resistant head on the clamp screw and the matching end on the change tool. The bottom of the horn plate is also interesting. These 4 surfaces act as bearings, and they also hold pressure on the tops of the lever stacks. The 4 guide pins that the lever stacks ride on fit into these 4 openings here. Once again, we'll be reassembling the lock in the unlocked position. We've reset all of the fence components back to the 0 position. This is all the way down and then just slightly back up. Begin inserting the guard levers first, one at a time, until all of the guard levers are back in the lock. The renter's driver must be inserted into the lock before the levers are put back in on the renter's side. The foot of the driver will not fit underneath the levers if you install the levers first. This is because we're assembling the lock in the unlocked position. Slide the levers in one at a time and slide them down their guide posts until they seat against the lock bolt. Continue on in this fashion until all of the levers have been replaced in the lock. When the last lever is back in place, bring in the guard driver and slide it back into position in the lock housing. Now, bring in the horn plate, slide it over the 2 drivers, and then secure it with the screws, and the reassembly is complete. Just as on the earlier locks, loosening the clamp screw on the renter side of the lock 3 complete turns will not only release the fence components, but it will also allow the lock bolt to slide further back into the lock, which will align the keyway on the renter side with the second key pull. Next, loosen the clamp screw on the guard side 3 turns, and we're ready to reset both lever stacks. First, insert the guard key into the guard side of the lock and turn it until it reaches a positive stop. Then, using the change tool, tighten the clamp screw on the guard side of the lock until the tool clicks twice. This will lock in the combination on the guard side of the lock. Using a cutaway lock that we've prepared to show you the operation of the levers, we're ready to set the renter's side. Insert the renter's key and turn it until it stops. Using the change tool, tighten the clamp screw until the tool clicks twice. Remove the tool and then use the key to throw the bolt. Check the operation of the lock and the setting is complete. In order to reset the renter's side of the lock when you have a working renter's key, first you must withdraw the lock bolt. To do this, you must use the correct guard key on the guard side of the lock. Then, use the working renter's key to withdraw the bolt completely. Then, use the change tool to loosen the clamp screw 3 complete turns. This will allow the lock bolt to withdraw slightly further into the lock case, and you will be able to remove the renter's key through the second key pull. Now, insert the new renter's key into the lock and turn it until it reaches a positive stop. Then, once again, using the change tool, tighten the clamp screw until the tool clicks twice. Then, check the operation of the lock, and the job is complete. Another interesting feature of this lock is that one of the screws which hold the lock onto the door is hidden behind this portion of the lock bolt when the bolt is in the locked position. If the lock is improperly set and you cannot withdraw the lock bolt, you will have to drill a hole through the lock bolt at this point. This will not do any serious damage to the lock, but before you reset the lock, be certain that you remove all metal shavings from the inside of the lock. When you purchase a new lock, it will come with a paper shim like this one. Do not throw the shim away. This is very important. Many times you will have to have the shim between the lock and the door in order to have the lock operate properly. Notice also that the lock is secured to the door by only 3 screws. That completes the Diebold 175/70. Now let's take a look at the Mosler Rapid Set lock. This lock is designed to be an inexpensive, exact replacement for the Mosler 5700 lock, which we covered in Volume 1 of this series. The 2 locks are identical in size, shape, and operation, except for the guard levers. The Rapid Set lock is designed to be set once and once only to an existing guard key. This lock is not a resettable lock. If the lock needs to be set a second time, it should either be replaced or disassembled. The first step in the disassembly process is, of course, to remove the horn plate. When you remove the horn plate, you will see immediately that this lock is virtually identical to the 5700. The major differences are that the noses and the horns are made from aluminum rather than brass. A quick way to disassemble this lock or the 5700 lock is to rotate the renter's driver 90 degrees and then lift. The foot on the bottom of the driver will lift the entire lever stack free of the lock. The levers can then be separated and laid out in a specific order so that you can reassemble the lock exactly the way that it came apart. The K-block lever and the renter's levers are identical to those found in the 5700 lock. The only difference is in the guard levers. Here we have 2 rapid set guard levers. The upper one has not been set. The lower one has been set to a particular key. During the setting procedure, the lever is actually bent at this point to match the new key. If a correctly set lock has an incorrect guard key inserted into it and turned with enough force, it can often re-bend one of the levers. If this happens, neither of the guard keys will then operate the lock. If the door is open, it's a relatively simple matter to disassemble the lock and re-bend the guard levers like this. Push the upper end of the lever down until it almost touches the rest of the lever. Then release. Now we can reassemble the lock and reset it with the setup key. Before we reassemble the lock, let's take a look at another unique feature of this lock. This lock is secured to the door by only 2 screws. The 5700 lock is secured with 4 screws. To begin the reassembly, first insert the renter's driver back into the lock housing, check the operation of the lock bolt, and then turn the driver so that the bolt is retracted. Next, bring in our K-block lever, slip it underneath the driver, and slide it over the pivot, and make sure that the gate engages with the fence on the lock bolt. We are assembling the lock in the unlocked position. Next comes the first renter's lever, slip it over the pivot and the fence, and then bring in a guard lever. Once again, slip it over the pivot and make sure that the gate aligns with the fence on the lock bolt. Continue in this fashion, alternating between renter's levers and guard levers until all of the levers are back in the lock. Once all of the levers are back in the lock, insert the guard driver into its socket in the lock housing, and then we're ready to replace the horn plate. Slide the horn plate over the two drivers and tighten the screw, and the reassembly is complete. To set up the guard side on a lock that has been reassembled in the unlocked position, all we have to do is insert the correct guard key into the guard side of the lock and turn it hard at least 3 times against its stop. Then turn the key back to the key pull position and then return the lock to the locked position by turning the renter's driver. Then turn the guard key, insert the correct renter's key into the lock, and the lock should work properly. Make sure that the bolt withdraws smoothly. Here we have a Mosler setup key for the rapid set lock and an actual guard key. The setup key is cut to the deepest possible cut in all positions down the length of the key. The rapid set lock is designed to work only with the corrugated guard key. This is a guard key which has a ward running down its length. New locks are shipped with all of the guard levers set up for the deepest possible cut on the key. So our setup key will operate the lock. Insert the setup key into the guard side of the lock and rotate it until it stops. Then, using one of the renter's keys, which was shipped with the lock, insert the key into the renter's side and withdraw the lock bolt. Once the lock bolt is all the way back, we can remove our setup key and then insert our new guard key. Once again, we will have to turn the new guard key at least 3 times hard against the stop. As you're turning the guard key, make sure that the renter's key does not turn back. The renter's key must stay in the all the way turned position. After turning the guard key at least 3 times, remove the guard key, throw the lock bolt by turning the renter's key, then reinsert the guard key back into the lock, turn it, and check the operation of the lock with the renter's key. Make sure that the lock bolt withdraws smoothly and without a catch. Once the guard side has been set up to the guard key, the setup key will no longer operate the lock. If one of the guard levers should become damaged while the lock is in the locked position, we will have to use a special tool to remove the renter's driver and manipulate the lock open. This and opening procedures for all of the safe deposit locks that we've covered in these 2 volumes will be covered in Safe Deposit Locks Volume 3. That completes Safe Deposit Locks Volume 2, Resettable Locks. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please write to us at this address: Tech Train Productions, Post Office Box 15401, Pensacola, Florida 32514. Or you can call our toll-free order line at 800-356-0136. You can also fax us at area code 850-476-7410. Or take a look at our website on the World Wide Web at www.techtrainproductions.com. Thank you for choosing Tech Train.